When I reviewed the Revel M105 speaker amp and headphone amp, it kind of transformed my world, not just because it's a fantastic sounding headphone amp, but also because it provides a relatively powerful, compact desktop speaker amp solution. But this isn't a review of the Revel M105. It's actually about what the Revel M105 allowed me to unlock, and that's the ability to run high quality desktop near-field style monitors. And in this case, we're talking about the Harbeth P3ESR XD. If you've done any research into compact, desktop or bookshelf style speakers, I'm guessing you've come across the Harbeths. And I've been fortunate enough now to have them in my office for a few months. I actually bought this pair because I enjoyed them so much. A little bit of a spoiler there, but I'll tell you a lot more about it than just the fact that they're good. And so let's jump in now and talk about how well the Harbeths will run in a near-field desktop solution, in a compact room type setup, and also what sorts of amplifiers I find work well with them, and whether it's worth spending this much money on a pair of speakers. These aren't cheap, there are cheaper speakers that measure very well and theoretically should perform as well, but do they really? Let's find out. Harbeth P3ESR XD come in at $3,300 US, making them a fairly expensive compact speaker. And there's no doubt that when you first get your hands on a pair of these, they certainly feel like they're worth the money. Now, things like weight and general feel of a speaker isn't necessarily indicative of its end performance, but in the case of the P3ESR XDs, these feel and look absolutely fantastic. These are a beautiful solid feeling cabinet design, they're made with solid timber instead of MDF as I understand it, and they're also using a fully sealed cabinet rather than a vent or a ported system. And for me that's important. I generally find that a sealed system is going to give you a more linear response, it's more consistent in its tonality because you're not relying on the port to provide that extra bit of emphasis down in the bass. And definitely that's some of what I heard when I started comparing the P3ESR to some other speakers which I'll talk about soon. While we're talking design and specs, let's have a quick tour and discussion of what's going on in the P3ESR XD, and that is that they're running a 110mm woofer and a 19mm tweeter. The woofers in these are a custom-made design for Harbeth, and it uses a specific injection molding design, which is a very expensive process to actually set up and prepare as far as I understand. But according to the Harbeth marketing materials, it was very important for them to do that because what they've done here is they've created a polymer that's both got metallic properties in terms of its ability to deliver the rigidity for bass punch, etc., but then also have the softness of, say, a plastic driver that's going to allow slightly better damping of the higher frequencies and give you a smoother overall sound. The end result is a lovely looking set of drivers if you do choose to take off the front grills. And when we're talking about the front grills, the way these remove, they do require either some good confidence in your fingernails, or you're going to need to get yourself a magnet to actually pry out these grills. It's just a mechanical fitting where they kind of wedge into these square channels around the side of the speaker. And it does make taking them off a little bit of a challenge. Putting them on is an absolute breeze. And for the sake of reference, for all of my testing and listening, I've just left them on. I quite like the look of the speaker with them on, and sound-wise, I've been very happy with them on as well. Carrying on with the specs and the P3ESR XD, these are rated from 75Hz all the way up to 20kHz. So these aren't going to give you a great deal of bass, they're not a particularly deep-reaching speaker, but for their size, they're completely fine, and obviously could be matched up with a sub very easily. Something else that's important to note is they're not a particularly efficient speaker, and that brings me back to what I was saying before about the Revel amplifier. You're not going to run these off a very lightweight tube amp, I'll talk about that a bit later as well, because these are rated as a 6-ohm load with a sensitivity of 83 decibels per 2.83 volts, which works out, if my maths is correct, at about 1 watt to produce 83 decibels. Now I haven't dived particularly deep to work out what frequency that was measured at, and I also haven't stopped to consider what the actual impedance curve of these is, how flat they are through the frequency range. What was more important to me was just how well different amplifiers could drive them, and I've got plenty of examples here in this video to give you a sense of what you can expect to use to get the most out of these and when you probably should choose a different speaker. What Harbeth recommend for these is a maximum amplifier power of about 50 watts and a recommended amplifier power of about 15 watts. So by no means do these need buckets and buckets of power, but at the same time, they're not as easy as some of the other compact speakers around the market. Before we start talking about sound quality and drivability, the last thing I want to mention, for those of you looking at these and thinking they look nice, this is the olive ash version of them. As I said before, they're hardwood cabinets, they're fully sealed, and in this case, it's the olive ash looking beautiful here. You can also buy them in a number of other timbers. It's all on the Harbeth website, and I'll link that down below. And then the other things I want to mention is over on the back of the speaker. Looking at the back of the speaker now, and there's two things that I want to mention. The first one is that we've got lovely binding posts here, so you can use a banana plug, you can use spades, you can obviously use bare wire if you want to. You've got plenty of options and a very high quality feeling connector. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that these use matched serial numbers. So each pair of speakers, when you buy the P3ESR XD, what you're actually getting is a pair that have been specifically matched to go together. And that's going to mean in terms of frequency response, they've been matched as closely as possible, so you're getting the best possible channel balance between them. And so as I said at the beginning, everything about these looks and feels really high quality, but then the test, as always, comes down to how good they sound. My office here that I do my filming and my daily work in is not a particularly good room for sound. I do have some minor treatment to stop reflections of my voice for recording, but beyond that, it's pretty basic. I've got a solid wooden desk in front of me, I've got all sorts of bits and pieces around my office, and it's not a room that I'm in a position to really treat properly for sound. And what that means is that I do have to deal with various issues within the room. There's a resonance at around about the 90 Hertz mark, I can't recall off the top of my head. But whichever speaker I put in here and I measure, I get a certain bass peak. And it's got nothing to do with the speakers, but it does mean that I have to actually make some adjustments via EQ, or in my case, convolution filters. And I raise that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because every speaker is going to perform a little bit differently depending on the room you put it in. And so unless you're able to treat the room or apply some sort of EQ or convolution filter, then it is going to be hard to say which speaker is going to perform well where. But for the sake of my maximum enjoyment and also some consistency when sharing reviews and comparisons of speakers with you, what I'll be applying to all of my speaker reviews from here forwards is I'm applying a convolution filter that I've produced within Room EQ Wizard, and I'm using a version of the Tool Olive House Curve. This basically means that my house curve starts with a slight lift down at 20 Hz of a couple of dB, and then gently tapers down to have about a -8 dB drop at 20 kHz. This is all based on research done by Tool and Olive. It's not my own work at all. You can actually look up the Tool Olive House Curve and you can find out more about it. But that's the house curve I landed on, and it's how I'm going to be doing all my tests. I'll do a video in the future showing how to actually create one of these for yourself if you're interested. And so make sure you subscribe if you're keen to find out more about that, and also if you're liking this and you want to see more speaker reviews from me. A couple of other things to mention in terms of setup of these speakers is that Harbeth recommend having them about 0.3 meters away from the nearest wall. That's no problems in my office. I've got quite a distance between my desk and the wall. And then the other thing to know is I've got roughly an equilateral triangle set up with about a meter between me and each speaker and between the speakers themselves. It might be a little bit wider between the speakers than 1 meter, but it's roughly an equilateral triangle. The speakers are then towed in at about 30 degrees. And I've got them sitting on a pair of Burson Launchpad speaker stands, which means the tweeters are basically at eye level for any speaker of around about this size. And so with all that said, let's start talking about how the Harbeth P3ESR XD performs in my setup. And the first thing I'd say is that they're wonderfully resolving. These are a speaker that's going to deliver you lots of detail, lots of clarity, but no aggression. What I love about them is that they're able to deliver all the information you need, but never get harsh, never get strident or shouty or aggressive. That results in a fantastic sense of transparency and honesty. And what I mean by honesty is they don't feel like they're colouring the music too much. They don't feel like they're getting involved in the music so much as just delivering it naturally to you. The imaging from these is fantastic. And they also perform really nicely off axis. So obviously in a situation like this where I've only got a fairly small space between me and the speakers, I'm not going to be off axis very much, but even if I move quite a lot to one side or other of my desk, they still maintain a really good image. Not quite as good as in the sweet spot, but there's not a massive drop off when I move to either side. As you'd expect from what I've already said about these, the bass does drop off fairly sharply, so based on measurements from about 80 Hz, it's a pretty steep decline. But the good news is they've got a nice sense of presence and body all the way down to that point. And so if you're not looking for deep thunderous bass, these are going to do a great job. But if you're into genres like EDM or others that have that deep bass extension, then you may want to add a sub because these are going to be a little bit lacking on those deep bass notes. And so ultimately, I'd sum up the sound performance of the P3ESR XD as really recognizing that they definitely show that tuning and that heritage of being a studio monitor, and that traditional BBC studio monitor as well. They're sweet enough that they're easy to listen to, but they're also neutral and honest enough that you can absolutely mix with them without worrying about throwing off the tonality of the end result. Having said that, they are going to reward you as well for pairing them up with better devices. These are not a speaker that's going to be overly kind if you feed them rubbish. So a poor or a harsh amplifier or DAC or an underpowered amplifier is going to be revealed by these because they're very honest about what's up the chain. And that's probably a nice point to step into some drivability and some amp matching options. I tried these across a bunch of different amps that I've got here, and I have to say that they are a fairly hungry speaker when it comes to power. The Enlium AMP23R, which I used for most of my testing, had no problems driving these absolutely beautifully in low gain mode. And that's because that amp is rated to put out 45 watts into 4 ohms. Keeping in mind these are a 6 ohm load, so not exactly on that 4 ohm mark, but there's plenty of power on tap. And everything I just said about the sound quality of the Harbeth is exactly what I was hearing from the AMP23R. Again, it's got that beautiful, smooth, sweet, but natural tonality, excellent imaging, and excellent detail retrieval. Moving over then, and these are in no particular order, it's just as I grabbed them and as I had them handy. Moving over then to the Linear Tube Audio MZ3, and this is rated at just 1 watt into a 4 ohm load. And the Harbeth were clearly stretching the limits of what the MZ3 could do. The MZ3 is not a particularly powerful speaker amp. It's one of those that's better thought of as being used with super sensitive speakers or as a preamp to a much more powerful power amp. And so as you'd expect, what I heard when pairing the Harbeths with the MZ3 was that it was at the edge of its limits. There was starting to be a bit of harshness to the sound. You could hear that the amp didn't really have the control over the drivers. It was starting to distort a little bit from an audible point of view. Obviously I didn't measure these, but just listening to it, it didn't sound clean and smooth and crisp the way it should. Flipping over then to a different tube amp in the Elekit TU8200R, and this one's rated at about 8 watts into a 4 to 8 ohm load. It's not entirely clear what the output is at each individual impedance, but again, it's got around about 8 watts going into this sort of a load, and it did have plenty of power. I felt like in a compact setup like this one, a smaller room, not too far between the listener and the speaker, an 8 watt powered amp like the TU8200R was doing a lovely job with the Harbeths. Because the TU8200R has so many options for tube rolling, it's hard for me to say exactly how it sounds. The key thing for me was that it had plenty of power, it was very comfortably driving the Harbeths, and they were sounding under control and well managed. But I'd probably want to tweak a little bit which tubes I had in the TU8200R to maximise the sound of the Harbeths. With the GEC KT66s that I had in the main sockets, I did feel like it was a bit too smooth. It wasn't allowing that sweet top-end detail and clarity to really come from the Harbeths. And so I would want to do some tube rolling, but if you have the TU8200R or you're thinking about buying an amplifier for the Harbeths, then I definitely think they could be a good combination. They just might need different tubes to what I was running with my headphones. And so moving on, I've got 2 more options. I might go with the next one being another tube amp, and that's an amp that I've got coming up in a review very soon, and it's the Redru SE5. This is another DIY amp, much like the Elekit TU8200R, but it's a more compact and less powerful amp, although it does still produce 5 watts into 4 ohms. As I listened to the SE5 driving the Harbeths, I did feel like it was just beginning to push the limits of what the SE5 was capable of. I could still get plenty of volume, but as I started to get to the upper ends, it was starting to sound a little bit ragged again. Not as bad as the MZ3, which was clearly outmatched in terms of power requirements. The MZ3 is a fantastic sounding amplifier, but just doesn't have the power for these. Whereas the SE5 was kind of just managing. What the SE5 did show me was that if you do get a lovely SET amplifier, that being single-ended triode, it's a type of tube amp, if you do get something like that, the Harbeth will absolutely reward you by bringing forth that beautiful sweet mid-range that most SET amps deliver. And so I do think that the SE5, as I've already said, was right at the edge of its capabilities, but if I wasn't looking for loud listening, it was a really lovely sonic match. So again, it's one of those that I think if you're getting around that 5 watts or less into a 4 to 6 ohm load, you're probably going to be stretching it just a little bit too much, pushing the amplifier too close to its limits and getting that ragged sound as a result. But if you can get anywhere above 5 watts, so I'd probably say about 8 watts plus, that's where I was hearing the Harbeths really, really work. And to give you further context, I've already said the speakers themselves were about 1 metre away from me. The room that they're in is about a 4 metre by 3 metre room, just to give you an idea. And so obviously if you are going to a bigger room or the speakers are going further away from you, then do bump up those requirements a little bit. But I think anywhere from about 8 to 10 watts plus, you're going to be able to get pretty good sound from the Harbeths unless you're looking for lots and lots of volume. And at that point, that's where I think Harbeth are probably spot on the money with a 15 watt recommendation. And so at this point, having gone through a bunch of different amplifiers, I had one left to try. It's way more powerful than needed, and it's the Burson Timekeeper GT. I've got a pair of these. These are a monoblock amplifier. They output 180 watts into a 4-ohm load, and the sound from the Timekeeper GTs into the Harbeths was nothing short of jaw-dropping. Beautiful imaging, spectacular clarity. I don't know necessarily if I'd say that the Timekeeper was necessarily better than the Revel M105, but I think it was more impressive initially. I've got the Timekeepers also in for a review, so I'll obviously do a full comparison between the Timekeepers and the Revel M105 when I get around to that one. But straight away, my first impression was that if you've got a massively powerful amplifier like the Timekeeper that's also high quality, then the Harbeths can really, really sing. Again, this comes back to what I said before, that beautiful sweet quality that they have of being both easy to listen to, very refined, very controlled, but with lots and lots of detail and resolution and clarity as well. It's really a wonderful speaker with the right amplification. But before you rush out and spend just shy of $3,500 on a pair of speakers because I'm saying they're wonderful, as I always like to try to do in my reviews, let me give you a comparison to really put them in context. I've also got the Revel or the Revel M105s here. These are actually made by the Harman company, so it's a sub-brand within the overall Harman brand. And the Revel M105s retail for about half the price of the Harbeths. But on paper, when you look at the information provided in the marketing for the Revels, everything would make you think that they're going to be absolutely just as good as the Harbeths. So I was curious to find out if that was the case, particularly given that in most situations you're probably going to need to run some kind of EQ or convolution filter to fix the frequency response. Is there any point spending more money on getting a fancy, lovely hardwood designed speaker, or should you just go with a more scientifically designed and possibly cheaper material speaker using MDF and plastics and stuff like that? Is that a better option given that you're going to apply convolution and EQ anyway? Now I should mention I haven't got footage yet of the Revel M105s, but I'll be doing a full review of those as well. So again, do hit the subscribe button if you want to catch that one. But for this testing, I was using exactly the same convolution filtering approach on both speakers to make things level, the same speaker stands, the same distance, the same amplifier. Everything was identical, just the speaker changed. And listening to Fireflies by Rag & Bone Man, what I started off hearing from the Harbeths was nothing short of spectacular. This track starts with a kind of funny treatment to the audio for the first 50 seconds or so just skip past that bit if you're listening to it and you want to hear what I was hearing. But once you get past that initial treatment of the sound, when it opens up, the Harbeths were just absolutely glorious on the guitars. There was this wonderful sense of clarity and attack on the strum, but also the richness and the resonance of the guitar behind it. The vocals in this track were nicely placed away from me, and there was a little bit of distance, I'd say, between the front of the speaker and where the vocals sat. So it produced a nice sense of space, both in terms of depth and also width in the soundstage. One thing that was interesting was that I found that the vocals were sitting a little bit behind the guitars coming out of the left and the right channels. Whether that's entirely accurate to the recording is hard for me to say, but either way, what it was doing was it was allowing me to have this really clean, and I keep pointing there because that's why I was hearing it, it allowed me to have this really clear sense of exactly where the vocal was coming from, the size, the shape of the vocalist, all of that was kind of there in the sound. It was fantastic. While we're talking about the vocal, the quality of that vocal was also excellent in terms of the combination of richness in the voice, but also texture in the voice. And so overall, it was a very enjoyable listen, and it was going to be a hard benchmark for the Revels to live up to. Switching over to the Revels and again applying convolution filters to basically match the frequency response. And what I heard was that the Revels couldn't quite capture that combination of the resonance and also the attack in the guitar. They felt like they just didn't have the level of, prowess, that technical prowess, to blend all those sounds together in such a seamless way. I should say that it still sounded absolutely fantastic, but you could definitely hear where the money's going to in the Harbeths in terms of sound quality. The treble from the Revels, say that 5 times fast, the treble from the Revels wasn't quite as refined. It was just a little bit scratchy at times, a little bit edgy at times. And this comes back to the idea that frequency response alone doesn't tell you the whole picture. The way the Harbeths are delivering those frequencies is better. To me, it sounds like they're controlling the sounds better, they're starting and stopping the sounds more effectively, the damping of the drivers might be better. And what that also leads to is that the sense of separation and imaging from the Harbeths is also a step ahead of the Revels. The Revels are fantastic, and I'll talk about them in depth in my review of them because they're an amazing speaker for the price. But I was somewhat comforted, given that I've paid for the Harbeth with my own money, I was somewhat comforted to hear that I do think these are worthwhile. Now, to be clear, I have bought both of these pairs of speakers, so it's not like I'm sitting here thinking that I have to justify the purchase of these. I could just as easily be selling these and keeping the Revels if that's what I chose to do from an enjoyment point of view. But the reality is, I do prefer the Harbeths. I think they're absolutely worth the extra money if you've got the money to spend. But having said that, they're also that much more difficult to drive. If I didn't have amplifiers capable of getting the most of them, then the Revels would come out on top because they're an easier speaker to drive. And so given amplifiers like the LTA MZ3 or even the Redru SE5, if I was using those lower powered sort of 5 watt and below amplifiers, the tables would absolutely have been turned here and the Revels would have come out sounding better because of the harshness that you get through the Harbeths if they're underdriven by the amplifier, or in other words, if they're overstressing the amplifier. And so hopefully at this point I've given you a really good sense of just how good the Harbeths are. I think these are a brilliant option if you're looking for a high-end, compact desktop or bookshelf speaker, particularly if you're looking for something that can be very neutral and very natural once obviously treated in the room or adjusted with EQ and convolution filters. The Harbeths are going to deliver you absolutely glorious sound without colouring the sound either. And that for me is where the absolute mastery is in these. They deliver sound that is equal parts natural and honest and transparent, but thoroughly enjoyable and musical and engaging at the same time. So if you are in the market for a pair of speakers and you've got the sort of budget, so around $3,300, then definitely consider the Harbeth P3ESR XD. If that's a bit too steep for you, or maybe you don't want to then have to also buy an amplifier with the power levels required for these, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and get ready for my review of the Revel M105 because those are fantastic too. I've also got some other speaker reviews lined up and some amplifier reviews, so there's plenty of speaker content coming. Make sure you stay tuned and watch out for those. But for now, I hope you found this video useful, helpful, enjoyable. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.